Loving God, we give you thanks for this moment shared together, for this doorway into gratitude and silence. We ask you to open all of our senses tonight so that we might hear your voice, answer your call, and do your will. And we make this prayer in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. The first part is going to focus on what I'm calling a kind of Ignatian anthropology. How do we understand the human being as a person moving in this universe? And then the second part is then how does that human person listen to and respond to the movements of spirits that might be moving within them and around them? The first is the heartfelt and simple question, not the big question, what does it mean to be human, but the heartfelt question in each of our hearts, which we may ask ourselves every now and then, what is it like to be me? What is it like to be me? I think discernment and all of Ignatian spirituality begins with that question. If we stop long enough to ask ourselves or other people, just tell me, what is it like to be you? What is your experience of being a person like? And we listen to those answers, we are doing discernment. The second question then is that we're not just static beings in one place, we're always moving and becoming something. So the second discernment question is, where am I going and why? What is it like to be me? And is it getting better or worse? Am I growing in freedom and love, or am I regressing in slavery and despair? In either case, no matter what direction I'm headed, what's helpful for me, or what's an obstacle to me? What is it like to be me, and where am I going and why? Are two new questions, which are versions of those two basic questions I began with. What does it mean to be human? And what would it mean to live life in the Spirit? We answer those questions individually and in communities by answering these personal questions. What is it like to be me? And where am I going and why? Ignatian spirituality and discernment is, as Mary Oliver would say, a doorway into gratitude, accepting the gift of our life, and silence in which that other voice might speak. So discernment is an exercise in silencing unhelpful narratives, bullying voices that may confuse or enslave us, so that we might attune our lives to that story of salvation that's being told in all of creation. It's our entering into conversation with the truth of our experience, with one another and with God. And all of this with the singular goal of helping us get free in order to love. So this first image is obviously a movie theater, and it's a Japanese photographer who goes to the theaters and just leaves his camera open for the entire length of a film. And so what we're seeing in this photograph is a story that was told, a whole movie that was shown, but it appears all white because it was the different moments where all the different points of light were exposed to the camera that all we see is a blank screen. So if we saw things this way all at once, our life would have no meaning. It would make no sense to us. And maybe this is an image that I use to begin, because maybe discernment is about slowing that time down so we can see the darkness, the shadows, the lights, and the blacks and the whites, the colors, all of those things, to help us to actually see and appreciate and love the story that's being told. If we never slow down and we don't discern between lights and shadows, then the story makes no sense. It's a striking image, but I would not pay to go back to see this film. If this was, if all I saw were this blank white screen, I would go ask for my money back. So these questions that I've already identified, that the life in the spirit, we would want to ask ourselves then, what does it mean to be alive? And what does it mean that this life might be lived in the spirit? So this first question then about what does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be alive? Is a question of both identity and orientation. It's a question what I've just repeated. What is it like to be me? And where am I going and why? And asking and answering these questions kinds of helps us, humanizes us, and helps us to grow in what I'm calling again our effective maturity, our freedom to love. Asking and answering these questions is the basis for asking other more important questions in our life, like vocational questions. What is something worth living for? Or mission-driven questions. How can I be a better service? Or how can I be a better lover? So what does Ignatius say about what does it mean to be human? He doesn't write long articles on theology, that's for sure. He writes a practical manual, the spiritual exercises, because he's interested in facilitating a conversation between a spiritual director and somebody who's making a retreat. And so his methodology, his way of teaching the wisdom that he received himself was not to write theological arguments or make publish different articles or treatises. His was to say, how can I invite people to talk with one another, to ask those questions? What is it like to be you? Where are you going and why? What is something worth living for? How can you be a better lover? Ignatius wanted to facilitate conversations more than he wanted to publish sort of defined theses. And so we're going to read through here just very quickly a few of the first paragraphs of St. Ignatius's exercises. His handbook for facilitating that conversation which would lead to a deepening capacity for a person's freedom to be discerning in their life. And as I go through these slides and we read through some of these paragraphs, the question I want you to have in your mind is, what does Ignatius think about the human person? What does he think it means to be a human being? So this first paragraph, this first sentence really, is just the title that Ignatius gives to his book. He says, these are spiritual exercises for the overcoming of self and the ordering of one's life on the basis of a decision made in freedom from any disordered attachment. In Spanish, ordenar su vida sin determinarse por afección alguna que desordenada sea. And then the next paragraph is what he calls a presupposition. This paragraph is sometimes referred to as Ignatius's version of presume the good. When you're talking to somebody else and you don't understand them or you disagree with them, every good Christian should be more ready to justify what they say than condemn them. We should presume the good in what somebody is saying, even if we think it's wrong, or presume the good in who they are, even if we are in disagreement. But this is the famous first principle and foundation, where Ignatius says, the human person is created to praise, reverence, and serve God our Lord, and by so doing to save his or her soul. So Ignatius begins by acknowledging that we aren't static beings, but that we're something that's becoming, that's growing, that's living, and that we are moved and capable of moving toward or away from our ultimate purpose, away from God or towards God, that we are all human, but we can be more or less free. And I think Ignatius is also interested not in just telling us what the answer is, but he wants us to engage in the conversation in a way where we experience what it means to be human, more than just having the theological definition figured out. Right? So he puts that, like, the theological answer is easy. What does it mean to be human? Well, we're made to praise, reverence, and serve God. That's it. You don't need to know anything else. But the whole rest of the text and the experience of the exercises is the long and slow process of experiencing and feeling and figuring out for myself, what does it mean for me to be human? What does it mean for me to be free in a way that I can accept love and love others without the attachments and sort of the traps of slavery and disordered affections that keep us from being fully human and fully free. And I just want to acknowledge and apologize for something that was kind of purposefully clouded, so that I think what I'm about to move to, I hope, will be much simpler. And maybe looking back on this first part of the conversation, we might have more appreciation of why that was important to say before we got to where we're going. And I say that just because, again, there's no version of teaching discernment where I can just tell you, here's what it is, that is worth the price of admission. That discernment, because it's about life in the Spirit, has to be learned and practiced and understood and taught experientially. And so that's where I'd like to move now in the second half of our conversation. If that's what it means to be human, that we are generally good, but we are in need of greater freedom, then what would it look like to live in the Spirit? Well, it would look like we would move and live and have our being in a way that was graceful and not against God, but flowing with God in that praise, reverence, and service in God's creation. This is the part in Ignatius's autobiography. Sorry, I got Spanish and English mixed in here, but where he begins to notice in his own life this movement of spirits that begins at first to confuse him, but then he starts to make sense of it. So if you know basically the life of Ignatius, right, you know that he was trying to move his life in one direction. He got gravely wounded, being an idiot, not being a hero. Don't let anybody tell you that Ignatius was a brave soldier. He was putting his own life and everybody else's at risk, trying to fight a losing battle. And I think if he looked back at that moment in Pamplona, he would tell us that he regretted what he did because he wasn't acting in freedom. He was acting out of an attachment to his pride that he didn't want to lose, and he almost got himself and everybody else killed. And so this is a paragraph from his recovery in Loyola, as he's recovering from that traumatic moment, and he has a lot of time to think, and he starts noticing his own thoughts. He says there was this difference that when he was thinking about that worldly stuff, he would take much delight. It'd be nice to think about. But when he left it aside after getting tired, he would find himself dry and discontented. But when he thought about going to Jerusalem barefoot and about not eating anything except herbs and about doing all the other rigors he was seeing the saints had done, not only used he to be consoled while in such thoughts, but he would remain content and happy even ever having left them aside. So Ignatius, in that silence of his recovery, begins to notice something strange. Thinking about fun things leaves him feeling bored. And thinking about terrible things, I don't know who wants to walk to Jerusalem barefoot or who wants to eat nothing but herbs. Thinking about those things leaves him feeling consoled. That's a problem for our usual logic of what we have been told about what it means to be human. Because we've been told that to be human, you're supposed to enjoy your life, it's supposed to be pleasant and just everything's rosy. That's what a good human life is. But Ignatius is noticing, you know what? I'm thinking of doing difficult things, and that leaves me feeling consoled. So it's a challenge to what we've been told about what it means to be human, that he's realizing, but in my human experience, I'm noticing that there's something about this that doesn't fit. It's not right. It's not true. So I love his language, he continues, but he wasn't investigating this, nor stopping to ponder this difference. He wasn't really thinking too hard about it until one time his eyes were opened just a little. And he began to marvel at the difference. And he reflected on it, picking it up from experience, that some thoughts he would be left sad and from others happy. And little by little, he came to know the difference in the kinds of spirits that were stirring, one from the devil and the other from God. Because this is the simple realization that Ignatius came to. All those big conversations, philosophical ideas about what does it mean to be human, all those narratives and stories we've been telling ourselves. He just noticed something very basic, which is sometimes we're happy and sometimes we're sad. And sometimes the thoughts we have about our happiness or our sadness make us happier or sadder. One of the weird things about being human is that we don't just have feelings, we have feelings about our feelings. And that's our affectivity. What he's beginning to notice is something that's psychologically very astute. He's beginning to notice that there's levels, there's complexity to himself. It's not just all good or all bad. And so he learns this, like I said, not from a Jesuit teaching him a big philosophical lecture about what it means to be human. He learns it by experience. What Ignatius noticed in his autobiography and what he's talking about here in the exercises is that we have different voices in our heads all the time, and they don't always agree with each other. That being human is not just about having conversations with each other, but like Padre Tuama, the poet at the beginning, it's about a conversation that's happening within us. And it's a conversation where there are some voices that are helpful to us, and there are other voices that are not helpful to us. So Ignatius is developing a theory then about our affectivity, the thoughts we have about our thoughts. And he's recognizing that we have different kinds of thoughts that have different effects on us. And what I think his whole theory of discernment is about, the map that he ends up making about the discernment of spirits, is a map that's intended to help us navigate those thoughts and feelings in a way where no matter what's happening in that complicated conversation in our minds and in our hearts, we might be able to listen to those voices, but realize that they're not all our voice. Sometimes the voice is my own voice. I really want a cheeseburger right now. That's usually my voice. Sometimes it's God's voice, but the cheeseburger is going to make you feel terrible, and you won't be as generous with your family, with your Jesuit community members. Maybe you shouldn't have that cheeseburger. And sometimes it's the evil spirit's voice, which is, who cares about my Jesuit community members? I want the damn cheeseburger and I'm going to go get it. All three of those things can happen in my mind when I start thinking about food, and not all of those are my will. Not all of those thoughts are my voice in my head. And the discernment of spirits is about letting those different voices be discerned in a way where I can recognize them and say, you know what? That voice that tells me not to care about my Jesuit community is a voice I don't want to listen to, because I made a commitment to love them and they love me. That voice that's sometimes quiet, that speaks about me taking care of myself and my health, that's a voice I don't often listen to, but I want to listen to more. And that voice that says, I want a hamburger, I love that's a part of who I am. And I can just affirm that whatever that is. I don't know why that hamburger example just popped into my mind, but there it is, right? I want to be able to recognize that my voice, God's voice, can be in a dialogue that can lead me to freedom. And sometimes I say, you know, God, I hear you that it's not good for me, but it's been a long day and I think I just need the hamburger, right? And I discern and I make the decision then to go up to Jim's Burgers and get one. This is my version of what I will call Ignatius's map of the discernment of spirits. So this is what I would say is Ignatius's map of what it means for us to be human. And let me talk you through this just for a minute. Up on the far left, upper left corner, you see principle and foundation, right? That we're made in love, by love, for love, to praise, reverence, and service. That's the basic point. That's the point of our lives. And I typed it out because the handwritten picture that I took, you couldn't really read very well. So you just see up there in the left corner, that's just the basic principle and foundation. The big picture idea is that we're supposed to love God. Punto. But then we have to realize that in order to do that, we're not always as close to that ideal as we'd like to be. So in the upper right-hand corner, you have a little plus sign. In the bottom left-hand corner, you have a little negative sign. And you have the human person, this person just in the middle, right? Who is standing between the ideal good and the negative bad. And so those questions then are, what is the good that we want to move towards? Having a goal, having a purpose. A map is not helpful if we don't know where it is we're supposed to go or where we want to go. Maps might be interesting, but they don't really help us move anywhere unless we know I need to get to Detroit. And then I find Detroit on the map and I find where I am and I move towards Detroit, right? Well, in the spiritual map that we have here, we could answer that question. What is the good that we want to move towards? Now, the easy answer is God. We all want to move towards God. But God has 1,000 names, and we might have different versions of what God is at different moments in our life. I want to move towards freedom. I want to move towards justice. I want to move towards generosity. I want to move towards those kinds of goods. And then that second question, the questions here are numbered. The second, then, what is the bad that I want to move away from? That's also important to know, not just what my goal is, but maybe what are the things that have trapped me in the past. I want to move away from addiction. I want to move away from hatred. I want to move away from slavery. I want to move away from callous indifference, right? That I put on my map an idea of where I want to move towards and what I'm trying to move away from. And then the next thing I would recognize is that I would put before me a question or an object of discernment that will help me move either towards or away from that. Those are maybe the decisions we have to make. I want to move towards love and away from hate. When Ignatius talks about the discernment, rules for discernment of spirits, he says rules by which to perceive and understand to some extent. I love that he doesn't expect perfection. He's not going to say we're going to understand perfectly. He says we're going to perceive to some extent. It'll be a little bit clearer the various movements that are produced in the soul. The good so that they might be accepted, and the bad that they might be rejected. If you're in a boat in the middle of the water, you want to know where the wind is moving and where the water is moving so that you can position your boat in such a way that you can move in the direction you want to move no matter what direction the wind or the water is moving. That's the trick to sailing. I used to think sailing was you just put up your sail and the wind pushes you wherever it goes. But that would be a very terrible sailor, right? A good sailor is the one who knows if I put my boat in this direction because I know where the wind is moving and I know where the water is moving, My boat will go where I want it to go, not where the water is moving and not where the wind is moving. And that's the spiritual freedom that we're looking for. But I hope I've asked enough of the right questions that might lead you into further reading and further reflection, that just lead in your own lives as human beings, brothers and sisters to one another, into the quality of that freedom where you can ask yourself, am I living the life based on that narrative that God is speaking, and that version of myself that wants most deeply to be with God and live for God? Or are there ways in which I'm living in a way that's unfree or attached in some way that I can still grow in and still learn in? And then that practice, I think, will be of service to you and to those people that you serve, if and when you have decisions to make. But I want to say that I just invite you to a notion of discernment that's more about sensitivity to all these movements around us and within us that limit our capacity to be free in our decision making, in just our daily lives. And so I think that's what I hope to have communicated, is that the human person lives within a context that's very complicated and very dynamic. And that discernment is a pause, like Mary Oliver invites us to, a silence, where we start to notice those movements. And we start to notice that some of the movements are dragging us away from where we want to be. Some of the movements are helping us closer to where we want to be. And that discernment, whatever we do with it, and there's different versions as you go through the next sessions, different practices and questions and moments of discernment. But all of them are essentially about the clarity of awareness, I would say, that are trying to help us, as Dean Brackley says, get free in order to love more freely and deeply and generously. But just as a way to close, again, this Irish poet, Pádraig Ó Tuama, who assures us that we can sort of, I invite you, maybe, he does this sometimes, invites people just to put a hand on their chest, on their heart, to know that there's a conversation happening within you and that it's a conversation worth listening to. And his poem, Narrative Theology, number 1. And I said to him, are there answers to all of this? And he said, the answer is in a story, and the story is being told. And I said, but there is so much pain. And she answered plainly, pain will happen. And then I said, will I ever find meaning? And they said, you will find meaning where you give meaning. The answer is in a story, and the story isn't finished.